In Bridgerton Season 3, Episode 4, Cressida compares Penelope and Colin to Eros and Psyche to Lord Debling. And my ears, like the ears of many other viewers, definitely perked up at this. And I said in my analysis and thoughts regarding Part 1 that I definitely wanted to swing back to this point, but I wanted to see how it was going to play out in Part 2. Because at the point that was said, I was like, well, that doesn't really fit. But then as I sat with it, I was like, oh, that is a harbinger. And when looking at the shape of Part 2, it actually fits very well. So now is the time that we are going to analyze Bridgerton, particularly Colin and Penelope's relationship, through the lens of the Cupid and Psyche myth, or Eros and Psyche. I'm going to try to stay consistent with Eros and Psyche based on that being how it was verbalized in the show, but I can't promise I will be. Just know that Eros and Cupid are the same person, but Eros does fit the idea being explored a little better just because of some of the connotations we built up culturally around the vision of Cupid. Now, when we're analyzing something through a particular lens, like when I looked at Taylor Swift's new album, The Tortured Poets Department, through the lens of Aristotle's Poetics, it's not going to be a perfect fit, right? But like when we're talking about the show in conversation with the book, it's interesting to think about how these two things are in conversation with each other and what the similarities and notably the deviations are saying. Now, I'm coming to this exploration as well a little bit from my dramaturgical angle in terms of what I might prepare for research for actors, and with that I've had to kind of rein myself in a little bit because I do have a habit of not wanting to speak on a topic unless I really feel like I have a mastery of it, and there is no way I have a mastery of this topic because we are spanning centuries of content here. However, I have been on record for years at this point on this channel as being a fan of the Eros and Psyche myth, particularly because it is the parent story for a group of fairy tales that I gravitate toward, those being East of the Sun, West of the Moon, and the most popular and well-known, Beauty and the Beast. And so Eros and Psyche as a story really kind of sits in an interesting liminal space, and we also know that I love a liminal space in that it is a little bit fairy tale, it is a little bit romance, but it's also a little bit allegory. And while we will kind of brush against the allegory of it today, that's really not what's going to be at the center of this exploration, but it's hard not to talk about it at all. However, it is probably the area I'm going to have the least kind of insight into, though notably I also think that is the area where we're pulling a lot of the overarching thematic ideas, particularly again for this second half, though there is a lot of groundwork in the first half, particularly in relation to characterization and some of these tropes in relation to this storytelling. But that seed getting planted in episode 4 is really the start of the majority of this arc. So before we dive all the way in, one, go ahead and like and subscribe if you haven't and you feel like it, but let's get on the same page about the Eros and Psyche myth, kind of a very condensed version therein. And I am going to link a 2012 blog post from Madeline Miller, yes, that Madeline Miller, below in relation to her retelling of the Eros and Psyche myth, particularly because I also really enjoy her insights and commentary within that post. But this is a myth that has been around for a long time. And again, I am not a historian of this myth. I say that because I know in previous conversations regarding Cupid and Psyche that we've had here, most recently the novel that came out last year, there have been people in the comment section that I have been very grateful to have there who are very knowledgeable about the myth. And of course, that leads to them having very strong opinions about some of the ways it is being retold in different iterations. But again, it's just that interest of how things are in conversation. But the first real written version of this myth we have is actually from the Roman, not the Greek, and it is in Apuleius's Metamorphoses, though you can obviously see the alternate title on this Penguin Classic Edition. Both are applicable. However, I have not read the entire novel yet. I have only read the Cupid and Psyche portion, and it is a story within a story of this man who has been turned into a donkey and is trying to turn back into a man. So very Midsummer Night's Dream from what I can glean from that setup. But within the story, we are told the myth of Cupid and Psyche, or Eros and Psyche again. And so I don't know how similar this is to Ovid's Metamorphoses, which I have read, because again, the framing device feels a little bit stronger there in the setup, but that is where we get the most kind of tangible, concrete, written version of this myth. Though, of course, there are going to be variations throughout the canon. So in the story, Psyche is a notable beauty to the point where people start seeking her out and worshiping her in a way in lieu of Aphrodite, which of course does not really endear Psyche to Aphrodite, to the point where Aphrodite seeks out Eros in order to get revenge on Psyche. And in another parallel to A Midsummer Night's Dream, because I'm sure Shakespeare was also pulling on Apuleius, Aphrodite charges her son Eros, who is the god of desire and has arrows he can point to people and make them fall in love. She charges him with making Psyche fall in love with the most hideous creature that he can, which coincides with a prophecy Psyche's family has gotten, in which they are told that she is basically fated to marry this like snake-like monster. And so they do the obviously reasonable thing in tying her to a rock to basically sacrifice her to this flying snake monster god that she is doomed to marry. Except there is no flying snake monster god waiting for her. There is just Eros, who is invisible due to his, god powers and whatnot, and he aims his arrows at Psyche, but he pricks himself in the process and thus falls madly in love with Psyche. Because of this, he has Zephyr basically whisk her away to his isolated palace, where she is waited on by invisible servants and fed magical appearing food. There are very evident elements of Beauty and the Beast here, which I think were very much explored, if I'm remembering correctly, in the most recent novelization from Luna McNamara of this story as well. And so in living in this beautiful isolated palace, Psyche meets Eros, but only under the cover of darkness, and she does not know that he is the god of desire. And notably, because he is only visiting her under cover of darkness, he has forbidden her basically from looking upon him. She is not allowed to see his true face. And they fall in love despite this and are living a very happy life, though discontent starts to seep in a little bit for Psyche in that she misses her family, she misses her home, and she gets Eros to agree to allow her sisters to visit her. However, her sisters do not have her best interests at heart, as Psyche thinks they do. And when they visit her, they become incredibly jealous by the wealth evident in this isolated palace. And they basically imply to Psyche and get her to believe that potentially her husband is some hideous monster, and that is why he is hiding his face. And they convince her to break her promise to him and get a candle to see his face. This is explored from the sister's point of view in the C.S. Lewis novel Till We Have Faces, though I have not read that for many, many years. It is a little bit like a kinder reimagining in the vein of Gregory Maguire in looking at these characters that are villains in this story, because the sisters in Eros and Psyche do not have happy endings. They are ultimately punished for this action and for their jealousy toward their sister. But while Psyche is holding a candle to see Eros's face, she sees that her husband is actually this gorgeous god of desire. But while she is looking upon his face, the candle wax hits him and wakes him up. It's actually not wax in the story, it's oil, and that is a distinction that I think matters, because oil is going to hurt a lot more than hot wax, though I do not want to wake up to hot wax being dropped on me. And so Eros wakes up and he disappears. He flees because there can be no love without faith, and this leaves Psyche to wander. She initially wanders to her sisters, which lead them to their ultimately grisly fate, similar kind of to Cinderella in a way as well, because Psyche tells them the story basically of how she came upon her husband and who her husband actually was. And so they basically put themselves and fling themselves off a mountain, attempting to become the bride of Eros, because they consider themselves just as worthy as Psyche. And they are not picked up by the west wind. So I think you can imagine what happens there. But Psyche is still distraught and wandering without her love. Meanwhile, Eros has fled back to his mother Aphrodite or Venus. And so eventually Psyche calls upon Venus after some of these wanderings, and Aphrodite ultimately gives her 3 trials. This is where we see some of that fairy tale-esque nature because of the use of threes that will become incredibly prevalent in fairy tales in particular. And so she is initially tasked with sorting a number of different grains from each other and gets the help of a bunch of ants. So we see those fairy tale beginnings or leanings there as well, in the help of the small woodland creatures. I mean, ants are creatures, it counts. And so after this, she has to also, I believe the second task, I just reread the story in the Metamorphoses today, but I believe the second task is to get some water from the river Styx, because the third task is Aphrodite tasking her to go down to Persephone and get a little bit of Persephone's beauty for Aphrodite, because Aphrodite needs it. But when she's coming back up, Psyche peeks into the box, so a little bit of Pandora thrown in there, and it is not in fact Persephone's beauty in there, and it is instead something that puts her to sleep. And this leads Eros to coming back to her side and kind of rescuing her from this sleeping spell, essentially. It's notable that Psyche also peeks into the box because she is wanting Eros to love her again. And in some ways, then, it works, because this causes him to go to Mount Olympus and go to the gods and basically petition for Psyche to be let into the ranks, which she is, and they end up, in the way of all romances, living happily ever after together, and they also have a daughter together, Pleasure. So I know we probably could have looked at all of that in tandem with the Bridgerton beats, but I thought it was good for us to kind of be on the same page before we dive into some of this, especially as some of this is going to take interpretation with the original stories. So again, if you are looking for a more expanded exploration of that, I have linked the Madeline Miller post below. Side note about Madeline Miller, I also read that Madeline Miller is also a dramaturg or has a dramaturgical background, and I was like, yes, that absolutely makes sense. So anyway, you can read that, and I will also try to find a Project Gutenberg version of the Apuleius if you want to read the more expanded original story as well. But even going back through the myth to that extent, I'm sure your wheels are also now turning in relation to how that coincides with Penelope and Colin's story in this season of Bridgerton. And while I said we're not going to go too far down the allegory path, the original myth is largely considered an allegory of the soul. Now, there are different interpretations of what it is ultimately saying about how the soul and desire are reconciled, but I did not go down the JSTOR rabbit hole, which is honestly something you should be incredibly proud of me for, because I would have been lost in there forever. However, I still think this is pertinent in looking at this season of Bridgerton through this lens, because in Penelope, we have a character who is attempting to reconcile these two parts of her identity, these two seemingly very different aspects of her identity. And we also have Colin, who is attempting to find himself, which presents as this yearning for a purpose. And especially in part 2, as we talked about in our part 2 analysis, we see him project his desire for Penelope into a purpose. Additionally, in part of that thematic framework we're building here, I do want to quote a line from the Madeline Miller blog post regarding the Eros and Psyche myth that I think is applicable here. And it says, "Struggling to trust our own understanding in the face of familial or societal pressure," which is very much what these two characters are grappling with. And again, reconciling their identities, but also how they fit in their families and society at large with these identities, and this kind of transfiguration of them as well over the course of the narrative, and seeing them kind of reconcile who they are publicly with who they are privately. Two varying levels of success, obviously, but again, we are looking at it through this particular lens. And in many ways, kind of looking at it through this particular lens has really illuminated a lot of the second part for me, down to the use of kind of light in the titles of episodes, particularly the framework and kind of bookend episodes, coinciding with the use of light in the Eros and Psyche myth, this idea of the use of light within the myth functioning very similarly to the idea of the mirror in this season. And we will talk more about that particular scene in a bit. But first, let's kind of cast our characters here in their respective roles within the myth. Not everything is going to be a perfect fit, but again, there is something interesting in that deviation. And there is a major deviation in the kind of reveal, particularly because we are looking at Colin as Eros, desire, and Penelope as Psyche, or the soul here. And with Colin in particular, like I mentioned a second ago, the desire kind of overlaps into the realm of the soul and the sense of self with Psyche, but we definitely see him sitting more on this desire side, and it feels like they're funneling this unsurety about his identity into desire, his desire to know himself, and how we see him project a different image of himself, particularly in part one, which also illuminates some of the decision making in the brothel scenes that were kind of contentious. Again, it's playing with this idea of Colin projecting who he thinks he's supposed to be, which circles back to this desire for an identity, but then is also kind of a shorthand for him attempting to be or aligning him with Eros in this particular moment, which is further emphasized then with this idea of him playing matchmaker for Penelope. Eros makes matches. Now, we do see this come back to prick him when he realizes his true feelings for Penelope. Notably, we don't have him being given a mission from the Aphrodite character, and we'll swing back to Aphrodite in a second, but we do see him kind of inhabiting this role of desire. Another aspect of this is Cupid being noted for his wings and the kind of flighty aspect of love. They're not really playing with Colin being flighty toward Penelope, even when he is angry at her and feels conflicted and betrayed. He doesn't question his feelings for her in those moments, but rather emphasizes how having those feelings exacerbate the pain. However, in a fight or flight scenario, he does tend to fly before a fight, and he has to kind of learn to fight for Penelope over the course of the season. And this isn't just Penelope specific or his relationship with Penelope specific, because we've seen him kind of fleeing from his family to the continent when he starts to feel restless or he doesn't know who he is. And so he's always kind of dealing with this. And it again circles back to this idea of him having this desire to know who he is. Another piece that supports Colin as Eros is Violet's strong belief in love as his maternal figure. Now, this is interesting, of course, because Penelope so strongly believes in love as the Psyche figure, which we will touch on in a second. Her as Psyche more than the love angle of it, but Violet Bridgerton so strongly believes in love. And this kind of circles back to, because again, Violet is not really functioning as Aphrodite in this story, that is the queen. But I did kind of look at and read some analysis that looked at the kind of duality of particularly love and desire, and how particularly goddesses like Venus or Aphrodite could inhabit the duality there. And so Violet kind of represents the Aphrodite of true love, while the queen represents the more antagonistic Aphrodite in this story, the Aphrodite that we really get in the Eros and Psyche myth, who in this case isn't so much threatened by Psyche's beauty taking attention away from her, but threatened by Penelope's mind and her wit. And we see throughout part two the kind of exploration of this, as well as the queen finally deciding that she likes having a kind of sparring partner in Penelope as Lady Whistledown, similarly to Aphrodite eventually accepting Psyche after the trials she is put through by Aphrodite herself, and the queen is honestly putting Penelope through some trials for sure. Now, with Penelope as Psyche, there is of course the wallflower angle at play, which is part of why I think they really played up the transformation and the confidence angle. We never question Penelope's beauty, because also we have eyes and Nicola Coughlan is gorgeous, but this is also part of the allegorical journey of Penelope as Psyche and kind of stepping into all of herself. As she told Colin in part two, him having given her the confidence to truly be herself. Are there other lenses we could look at this aspect through? Absolutely. But this is the particular lens that we're analyzing it through now, and just kind of illustrates all the different interpretations that a piece of work really can have. And so with Penelope as Psyche, and Psyche being this kind of idea or embodiment of the soul, Penelope having a whole lot more personality than Psyche because she's this kind of stand-in embodiment in this kind of allegorical fairy tale, and so there's less character development there. But we see with Penelope as Lady Whistledown, Lady Whistledown's ability to kind of cut to the soul of the thing, and her insight and ability to really see into someone and the soul of someone there, which is really illustrated by her comments about Colin in part 1. Now, granted, this is also because she knows Colin so well, but I think that that's definitely at play and one of the uses of Lady Whistledown here, especially because Lady Whistledown in the show has transcended past just a kind of framing device or vehicle for exposition, as she kind of exists for many of the books. And so we're looking at it from a slightly different angle, and from this particular angle, it really aligns with that exploration of the soul. Another piece in the Penelope as Psyche puzzle is the fact that she has two sisters, and especially in part 2, when Penelope starts getting more attention, as Psyche does in the original myth, we see that jealousy, particularly from Prudence, come into play. Thankfully, they have a much happier ending in the show than in the original myth. Now, in the original myth, Psyche is staring down marriage with a giant winged serpent, because that is absolutely allowed in addition to being possible, apparently. However, Penelope is staring down a beast of a different kind, either spinsterhood, as set out at the beginning of the season, or as we move into the season, a loveless marriage. And so we see Colin as Eros and Desire coming in and changing that fate when he falls in love with her, when he pricks himself with his own arrow, metaphorically, and then she is given this kind of fairy tale dream, her fairy tale dream, in this kind of honeymoon period, even though it is before their honeymoon with Colin. And so we see a lot of that kind of falling in love period, which admittedly, even in the myth, is very condensed and short, because fairy tales have a different kind of cadence. They may tell you a little bit more than show, but we see them falling in love in that period. And with Penelope and Colin, we see this mirrored from basically the carriage scene through him finding out. Because, I mean, those are the plot beats, right? The moment Eros gets oil spilled on him, the moment Colin sees Penelope down that, I think it's technically an alley, down the street, wherever they technically are. But in the interim, we have this mirror scene. It is set at their new home, and so we are kind of seeing them set up house in this moment. We're establishing this place, and so it's moving outside of the realm of what they know, and it's taking Penelope as Psyche to this new place. Now, it is noticeably different in that we see this scene take place in full daylight, where in the myth, Psyche only interacts with Eros under the cover of darkness and doesn't get to see his true face. Now, again, we are a little bit more metaphorical in the show, in some ways, in kind of playing with this revelation of true self and the Lady Whistledown plotline, but in many ways, they are much, much closer than it may seem. And so we have these characters that are being kept in darkness in some way, again, kind of swinging back to the titles of the episodes themselves that are bookending this season. Now, it also kind of goes back to this idea we talked about the secret kind of hanging over even some of these happier moments in the season. And we see this in the original myth as well. And so this idea of, can you fall in love with someone when you don't truly know them? Or also conversely, how do you truly know someone? Does seeing their face truly impact who you know them to be? This is, of course, complicated and exacerbated by the Lady Whistledown plotline, but playing in more similarities than I think it may first appear. But in going back to the secret hanging over even some of the happiest moments, it goes back to a line in at least this iteration of the myth that says, "But as I was thrilling to the glorious sight, overwhelmed with pleasure, but in anguish because I was powerless to enjoy it." In this case, I think that is referring to the moment of revelation right before the oil hits Eros. But in relation to Penelope's arc, this kind of sitting with her this whole time, because in the case of this story, it is Penelope or Psyche who has the secret. Now, we see a lot of this play out in the same way in the after, but there is a huge deviation in that as well. And so it's also this, like, what are the secrets that the soul holds, and how does that potentially imperil our future happiness and ultimate desire? You know what? I said I'm not going to get allegorical, and I have no right to be kind of contemplating philosophical questions. So let's move back to the mirror scene for just a second, because I also think it's notable that Penelope looks so much like a Renaissance painting in that scene. We all know it is glorious because I will take no further opinions on that. However, it is interesting because the Renaissance saw kind of a revival of the Eros and Psyche myth and the kind of influence of the myth on art. And so to kind of have Penelope kind of visually representing some of that Renaissance art in some ways as well is really interesting. Now, again, don't quote me too confidently on that, in that I am not an expert on art or art history, but I do think that a lot of us picked up on those parallels there, even outside of the Eros and Psyche myth element of it. Now, it's also kind of interesting in terms of the reveal of things in relation to the Eros and Psyche myth with Penelope and Colin, because we have Penelope's sisters kind of acting as Psyche's sisters in many ways, but they're not really close enough to her in any way to have some of that confidence in relation to encouraging her to reveal anything. So in this way, we see her kind of chosen sister, Eloise, really fitting this role. And in some ways, we're seeing some of that jealousy in Eloise. Now, granted, she has completely valid reasons to have been hurt by Penelope in this friendship based on, you know, the plot of the show. However, especially in part 2, we see her kind of grappling with this idea that these two very important people in her life love each other, and whether that diminishes any of the love they hold for her and the jealousy therein. And so she is encouraging Penelope in this part of the season to reveal her identity to Colin. Now, her motivations for this are much more genuine than Psyche's sisters, right? She does not want to see her brother hurt. She ultimately thinks holding the secret will hurt Penelope. And so there are different motivations to that revelation. And ultimately, she doesn't really drive the revelation, right? Because while Psyche's revelation and splitting of that relationship is caused by her own actions, in that she is notably doing something that she has been told not to do, though we could, of course, have a whole side discussion on whether this is her being punished for having curiosity or literally wanting to know who she shares a home with. Like, this idea of blind trust within a relationship like this, I think is a little different, and I will happily lean into more of the allegorical implications there in order to make that work mentally for me. But it's much different with Colin and Penelope in that it is Colin following Penelope. So in some ways it is still an accidental revelation, but it is still the moment that tears them apart. And this is where I think that viewing things through the lens of this myth in particular kind of reveal a lot more about this part of the season than I anticipated kind of going into this analysis. Because like I said, in the myth, the moment that Eros wakes up, that moment of betrayal, he flies back to Aphrodite. They are separated. And then Penelope, or Psyche in the myth, I'm clearly mixing up my characters even more than I anticipated, has to go through a set of trials in order to get him back. This is, of course, further complicated in the show, as it all is, by a lot of extra stuff going on. But there is something very notable in this. Now, I have been on record many a time talking about, while I love this story and story family, I don't particularly love the trials part of this story and story family, especially because they can often go on a little long. Now, I will give the show this. We didn't necessarily get trials as much, but we absolutely got that separation. And much as Eros immediately flees back to Aphrodite, Colin flees back to the Bridgerton home. However, I think it is notable that while he has kind of emotionally distanced himself for his own protection in a lot of ways, he still is physically close to Penelope at the same time. So they are playing with that distance and kind of mirroring the distance of this original myth, while also showing Colin really grappling with this. And we do see this grappled with later in the myth, particularly because we do see Psyche and Eros kind of cross paths again, but we lean into that kind of exploration more than the sorting of seeds exploration, which I'm not going to complain about. Now, while we don't get as straightforward of trials as we do in the original myth, we do still see some of these same kind of consequences in the kind of fallout of this revelation in the show. For instance, within the exacerbation of the Lady Whistledown plotline, and notably Cressida taking on the voice of Lady Whistledown and kind of shaming the Bridgertons in her release, we have a kind of reflection of this quote from the myth. Now throughout the whole world, the good name of all Venus's family was besmirched by all kinds of slanderous reports. And so there is this kind of hit to the ego, which we see the complications of that, and Penelope kind of grappling with whether she still can be Lady Whistledown, whether she can give up this power for love, how it's impacting this family she loves, and the kind of gossip that is circulating there, the danger she is putting them in by remaining as Lady Whistledown, but also how she can use her voice to now protect them in certain circumstances as well by releasing her issue to contrast against Cressida's, and feeding further into that idea of Lady Whistledown and the power she holds, Penelope holds as Lady Whistledown. There is also a moment or a quote from the original myth in which it indicates that Eros, in his despair, because of his despair, there are no more marriages. And in Bridgerton, we see members of the Ton lamenting the things that Lady Whistledown is not going to report on, which also circles back to Lady Whistledown introducing the new debutantes of the season at the beginning of season 3, and kind of cementing how much power she actually has in those moments. So while we can kind of place Penelope and Colin as Psyche and Eros respectively, again, there is some overlap and bleeding there that kind of just further fleshes out their characters as well. So again, that's just further evidence that this is a lens through which we are analyzing something, not a perfect transposing. I also think it's of note because once Colin has fled, we don't really see him interacting too much with anyone that would be considered an Aphrodite character in this iteration, right? He doesn't really discuss anything with his mother on camera in part 2. He doesn't really interact with the queen. But in the original myth, Aphrodite goes off on Eros for his perceived mistakes and really emphasizes his age, calling him adolescent. Now, she is reminded later of how old Eros actually is, but I found this particularly interesting because we have these two characters who are notably much younger than they were in their book by the time of their love story. And so in many ways, we are dealing with adolescence. We have two characters who are just coming in to their own for the first time, which we obviously see kind of mirrored in this kind of allegorical exploration of their true selves and finding themselves through love. But there is this element of growing up to it. And so in this current kind of stasis of this part of our stories, we have our lovers separated. And in both iterations, while Penelope doesn't go through as many active trials as Psyche does, she is wandering. And in the myth itself, which I didn't mention in my Spark Notes of the Spark Notes, there is a moment where Psyche is basically tortured by care and sorrow. So again, really leaning into the allegory there. But I think we see that very much the case in this second part. Her grappling with the sadness of this separation while still caring for Colin, and while we don't see the trials as explicitly kind of correlate, we do still see a Penelope that is trying to drive toward reconciliation. In this case, reconciliation with Colin additionally aligns with her kind of reconciling again these two parts of herself. And this is again contributing to a lot of that distance in part 2. So it's functioning very similar to the trials in that we are separating these two characters from each other. And maybe that is part of the reason that I don't like that part of these myths, that separation, because even in the myth, when Psyche and Eros are briefly under the same roof with Aphrodite, they are still kept separated. And we see this illustrated as well in Colin sleeping on the couch. Though again, that circles back to some of the deviations as well, in that he is still in his own way trying to be as close to Penelope as possible. Another piece of this part, I think, as well, is in the original myth, we see a physically wounded Eros. So that is clearly symbolic of the emotional wound he has been served that we see play out more as the emotional wound with Colin, but that is part of what is contributing to that distance. So Eros isn't really capable of being close to Psyche until that wound is healed. We see that wound heal with Colin, and so Colin needs time to heal from that wound, and we still see him drawn to Penelope despite this. Now, a slight aside, though it is revealed at this part of the myth, it is notable that Psyche and Penelope are both technically pregnant during their wanderings and trials, and though we don't see that revealed in Penelope's story until the epilogue, that is definitely still a similarity between the two. Now, like I said, while I don't see as many direct correlations between Psyche's trials and Penelope's actions, though of course you can correct me if you feel there are some there, it is notable that Penelope really still is the driver of the second part. And we've talked about this kind of throughout the season, right? How much autonomy that Penelope has been given in this season. And so she, as Psyche, really is in charge of this reconciliation in some ways, because even though the kind of aspect of the revelation is flipped in some way, it is still Psyche or Penelope's betrayal at whatever level you consider that kind of spurs this action, which also may be why we see a Penelope that is much more apologetic in relation to her taking ownership of that Lady Whistledown identity and her past actions therein than we see in the book. Of course, again, as we've discussed, the actions of Lady Whistledown vary greatly there, but we don't see her fighting as much for why she took that identity on in the first place. We see the internal struggle of it, absolutely. We do see her kind of lay it bare a little bit for Colin after the Queen has accused one of the Bridgertons of being Lady Whistledown, rightly, I guess, at that point. But again, she's much more apologetic all around. Now, where I can see one of the trials aligning is in the final trial, where we see Psyche open the box of Persephone's beauty that is really a sleeping potion and her being kind of frozen, and Eros having to save her and come in at that moment because he is healed. He has come to his realization. Now, the kind of plot beats of this play out much differently in Bridgerton, but we do see Colin go to Cressida and have that instinct to fight for Penelope. Now, he notably makes it worse, but this is the moment that spurs Penelope into the action, because this is where we see a lot of the deviation as well in terms of Penelope taking ownership of that action, because in the original myth, like in the original book, we see Eros or Colin kind of step in to the savior role, whether it be going to Mount Olympus and petitioning for Psyche's immortality, or it be kind of collecting the Bridgertons and making this stand at a ball to protect Penelope as Lady Whistledown. But in the show, we know that Penelope claims that identity for herself and that Colin is not orchestrating anything there. It is Penelope that is doing the orchestrating. However, the resolution itself doesn't ultimately deviate that much, because we see Eros going to Mount Olympus and petitioning for Psyche to be accepted into the ranks, and we see Penelope in front of the entire ton basically making her case and asking to be accepted as her full self into their ranks. In this moment, we see the Queen as Aphrodite essentially issuing her a pardon, as we see Aphrodite eventually dancing at Psyche and Eros's Mount Olympus wedding. But we also see the rest of the ton ultimately, if quietly, accepting Penelope into their ranks at the Dankworth Finch ball. And in that moment, like, the gods have to decide whether they are going to accept Psyche into their ranks. The ton has to decide if they will accept Penelope as she truly is into theirs. Now, I am not saying in this moment that the aristocracy are gods by any means. I am just articulating the correlations I see between the stories. And like Psyche eventually in her happily ever after also attains immortality, Penelope doesn't gain immortality in that way. However, her offer of an annulment to Colin is in sense kind of an ego death and rebirth for her. And so we see Psyche's rebirth as a goddess, and we see Penelope's rebirth in this moment, as well as the rebirth of the relationship between Colin and Penelope in this more aligned state. Additionally, while Penelope doesn't again attain actual immortality, because then we would be in even more of a fantasy than we kind of exist within the world of historical romance. However, Penelope does gain a sense or a kind of immortality in taking ownership of her writing and the fact that her words will live on. And so, to my kind of interpretation, if Eros and Psyche is this allegory of the soul, I think Colin and Penelope's iteration is a look at finding true love once you have found your true self. Or maybe more accurately, accepting your true self. So again, that's kind of my overarching analysis. I'm sure there are pieces I didn't pick up on, and I would love for you to leave those below if you did. But I think that looking at the season, particularly the second half of the season, through this lens further illuminates what they were trying to do with this part of the season. Now, again, we can have ideas about whether or not it was ultimately successful in that, but I think one of the joys of media is being able to look at things through different lenses, from different points of view, from different angles, to kind of analyze things from different perspectives and kind of unpack to whatever degree. I'm not saying I've successfully unpacked anything here, because again, these are just kind of my ramblings, though I did really try to organize them this time. However, I do think that it is notable that particularly in episode 4, they verbalized the Eros and Psyche parallel, because I do not think that was an accident, further emphasized by all of the parallels and mirroring that we see with that myth throughout the rest of the season. And so in some ways, it is taking us back to that original love story. But I would love to hear your thoughts on everything below. Thank you, as always, for hanging in there and listening to my thoughts, being interested in my thoughts at all. If you are interested in further thoughts, one, I do have a couple more videos about Cupid and Psyche that you can go to in relation to other iterations or books that are retelling this myth. But also, you could, again, like and subscribe and hang out for more content in the future. But most importantly, I think that you should read something good. And yeah, bye.